Along the coast of Massachusetts, there are places where the ocean retreats and reveals land that should never be walked upon. Vast stretches of wet sand emerge with the falling tide, glistening under gray skies and pale moonlight. To the untrained eye, they seem calm, peaceful, almost inviting. But when the water pulls back, it exposes more than shells and seaweed. Footprints appear where no one has walked. Shadows stretch across the flats even when nothing stands between the sun and the horizon. And voices carry across the open land, whispering from places where the sea once covered everything. Tidal flats are not beaches. They are temporary worlds, caught between land and ocean, belonging fully to neither. For centuries, these flats have claimed lives. Fishermen trapped by rising tides. Travelers swallowed by mud. Entire boats dragged away when the water returned without warning. Locals say the flats remember every soul they took. And when the tide goes out, the dead sometimes come with it. Tonight, we walk the most haunted tidal flats in Massachusetts, places where the ocean reveals its secrets only briefly, and the past rises with the smell of salt and decay. If you found yourself alone on a tidal flat at night, and heard footsteps moving toward you across the wet sand, would you wait to see who was coming, or would you run before the sea returned? Hello, my dear friend. I hope you are warm and safe, because the places we are about to explore are cold, exposed, and unforgiving. Massachusetts has one of the longest and most dangerous coastlines in America. Its tides move quickly, its weather shifts without warning, and its history is soaked into the shoreline. Long before modern navigation, tidal flats were used by fishermen, traders, and entire coastal communities. But the flats were never kind. Mud could trap a person in seconds. Fog could erase all sense of direction. And the returning tide could surround you before you realized it was too late. Many disappeared. Some were found days later. Others were never recovered at all. Visitors today report strange sensations when walking these flats. Sudden pressure in the chest. The feeling of being watched from behind. Voices calling out across the open land, even when no one else is there. Some claim to see figures standing far away, motionless, only to realize the distance between them never changes. Before we step onto these exposed seabeds together, let me ask you something. If you were walking across a tidal flat as the sun set, and heard someone calling your name from far behind you, would you turn around to look, or would you keep walking and hope the voice faded with the wind? Take a slow breath. And let us begin our journey across the most haunted tidal flats in Massachusetts. Plum Island flats reveal themselves slowly as the tide retreats, stretching outward from the shoreline in long, glistening bands of wet sand. During daylight hours, the flats feel calm and expansive. The air is open, carrying the scent of salt and distant water. With the ocean drawn back, the danger feels removed, held far away beyond the visible edge. Visitors often underestimate the scale. What appears to be a short walk quickly becomes a long crossing. Landmarks remain fixed, refusing to grow nearer. The flats stretch endlessly, their uniform surface offering little sense of progress. Still, the openness is reassuring. With nothing obstructing the view, it feels impossible to become lost. As the tide begins to turn, the atmosphere changes. The first sound many report is a voice. It comes from behind, carried low and clear across the flats. At first it seems distant, easily mistaken for another visitor or a call from the shoreline. The shoreline appears unchanged. No one stands there. Yet the voice returns moments later, louder and closer, repeating its call with increased urgency. The sound carries unnaturally well across the open flats, unbroken by wind or distance. Visitors describe an instinctive pull to answer, to turn back and follow the sound. The voice feels familiar, not threatening, and that familiarity makes it difficult to ignore. Some report hearing multiple voices layered together, rising and falling as the water begins its slow return. As the tide advances, the flats lose their stillness. Shallow channels fill quietly, threading water back across the sand. The voices grow louder now, closer to the ears rather than the horizon, calling insistently from behind. Those who continue forward often notice movement far ahead. Shadowy figures appear on the distant line where the flats meet the sky. They stand upright and still, their shapes dark against the pale background. At first glance, they resemble other walkers, perhaps waiting or observing. No matter how long one walks toward them, the figures remain just as far away. They do not approach. They do not retreat. They hold their positions with unnatural patience, always beyond reach, always watching. Some visitors say the figures shift slightly when the tide moves faster, adjusting their stance but never closing the distance. Turning away from them brings no relief. The voices from behind grow louder still, now carrying emotion. Urgency. Concern. Sometimes what sounds like warning. Local knowledge paints a different picture. At low tide, the land invites exploration, but the returning water moves faster than expected. Channels deepen silently. Routes that were clear minutes earlier become impassable without warning. Historical accounts describe travelers who ventured too far, misjudging time and distance. Search efforts were often delayed by weather and darkness. In many cases, nothing was found beyond disturbed sand and incomplete paths. The voices are never mentioned in official records. They exist only in personal accounts, shared quietly among those who have walked the flats and returned unsettled. Many hesitate to speak about what they heard, unsure whether it was imagination shaped by isolation and fear. Yet the details remain consistent. The voices always come from behind. They always grow louder as the tide turns. They never lead forward, only back. And those who turn fully toward the sound often report a moment of disorientation, as though the landscape shifts subtly, distances warping just enough to confuse direction. The shadowy figures on the horizon never speak. They serve as silent markers, drawing attention forward while offering no assistance. Some believe they are illusions caused by heat haze and reflection, common on wide, flat surfaces. Others insist the figures remain visible even under conditions where such effects should not occur. What unsettles most visitors is the emotional weight of the experience. The flats do not inspire panic immediately. Instead, they create doubt. A slow erosion of certainty. Each step feels both correct and questionable, as though the land itself is testing attention and resolve. As water continues to return, the voices reach their peak, calling insistently, overlapping, filling the air behind the listener. Those who resist the urge to turn often describe physical strain, a pressure in the head, a tightening in the chest that makes forward movement feel wrong. Those who do turn back frequently find the voices fading as quickly as they appeared, leaving only the sound of water and breath. The figures on the horizon disappear without movement, dissolving into the haze as if they were never there. By the time visitors reach solid ground again, the flats are already changing. Water covers the paths completely, erasing footprints and any trace of passage. The land that felt endless becomes unreachable, reclaimed without ceremony. From shore, nothing suggests danger or deception. The sand glistens patiently, waiting for the next retreat of the tide. Those who have heard the voices rarely return without caution. They remember how the sound followed them, how it seemed to know exactly when to speak. They remember the figures that waited without moving, neither guiding nor warning. Plum Island flats do not trap with force. They persuade. They offer openness and familiarity, then test perception as conditions shift. The voices call from behind, the figures wait ahead, and the tide moves silently beneath it all. And when the water finally closes the flats again, the land gives no sign of what occurred there, leaving only memory behind, and the quiet certainty that some paths appear safest just before they disappear. Cape Cod Bay flats stretch outward where the tide retreats and the land reveals itself slowly, mile after mile of rippled sand and shallow water. By day, the flats appear calm and ordinary. Fishermen walk their familiar routes. Birds skim the surface. The horizon feels wide and predictable. The bay breathes in and out with the tide, exposing ground that exists only temporarily before the sea returns to claim it again. Night transforms the flats completely. When the moon rises, the exposed sand begins to glow faintly, not bright enough to illuminate the way, but enough to outline shapes and contours that disappear in daylight. The surface reflects pale light unevenly, creating the illusion of movement where nothing stirs. Fishermen who work the flats after dark notice it first in the distance. Small points of light appear low to the ground, drifting across the sand as if carried by unseen hands. They resemble lanterns, the old kind once used before modern navigation lights, warm and steady rather than sharp or electric. There are no boats nearby. The tide is out. The flats are exposed. They move anyway, gliding smoothly over ground that should resist such motion. They do not bob like reflections. They travel with purpose, sometimes separating, sometimes drawing closer together, always silent. Those who stop to watch describe a sense of hesitation. The lights do not approach directly. They cross paths at angles that suggest routes rather than wandering. The moment a fisherman shifts position or steps toward them, the lights dim slightly, then continue on as if unaffected. No sound accompanies them. No footsteps. No voices. Only the distant water and the soft wind off the bay. When clouds pass over the moon, the lights fade completely, leaving the flats empty once more. Then there are the footprints. The sand at low tide holds impressions clearly, especially when damp. Fishermen are used to tracking their own steps back toward shore, following familiar patterns carved by habit. A second set of footprints appears beside their own, perfectly aligned. There is no sign of approach. The extra footprints begin and end abruptly, appearing alongside the fisherman's path without leading in from another direction. Those who stop walking see the prints end where they stand. Those who continue find the matching steps resume. The sensation that follows is difficult to describe. Not fear in the sharp sense, but awareness. The feeling of proximity without presence. Some call out instinctively. There is never a response. The flats themselves seem unchanged. No disturbance beyond the prints. No shadow cast by a second body. No sound of breath or fabric. Just the quiet mirror of their own passage reflected back to them. Local stories about the flats go back generations. Long before modern navigation, these waters were treacherous. The tide could turn quickly, cutting off routes back to shore. Fog rolled in without warning. Lanterns guided people across the flats at night, marking safe paths between channels. Boats grounded. Walkers misjudged distance. The bay reclaimed ground and erased mistakes without trace. Over time, the flats became associated with disappearance rather than danger, a place where people simply did not return, leaving behind only stories. The lantern lights are often linked to those stories. Some believe they mark old routes, replaying paths that once mattered. Others think they represent guides that appear too late, visible only after the tide has already turned. They do not lead toward safety or danger. They simply mirror. The perfect match suggests intention rather than accident, as if the flats themselves are walking alongside those who cross them, testing rhythm and pace. Scientists offer explanations for parts of the phenomenon. Bioluminescent organisms can cause faint glows under certain conditions. Moist sand can reflect moonlight in ways that create illusion. Wind and shifting pressure can alter how sound and light behave across open terrain. These explanations account for light and shadow. They do not explain the precision of the footprints. They do not explain how impressions appear without entry or exit points. They do not explain why the stride always matches exactly, regardless of the person walking. Fishermen who experience both the lights and the footprints on the same night describe a heightened sense of time. Minutes stretch. Distance feels unreliable. The shore appears closer or farther than expected. Familiar landmarks seem slightly misplaced, as if the flats have adjusted their scale. Most choose to turn back immediately. When they do, the footprints disappear first. The matching steps stop, leaving only the fisherman's own trail behind. The lantern lights fade shortly after, dissolving into the moonlit sand. Those who continue onward report stronger sensations. The glow intensifies slightly. The prints stay close. The urge to hurry grows, paired with the feeling that something is pacing them patiently, neither urging nor resisting. The experience always ends when the tide begins to return. Water creeps back across the flats, softening edges and filling impressions. Tracks vanish. The glowing sand dulls. The lantern lights never appear once water covers the ground. Morning brings no evidence. The flats look ordinary again. Footprints are erased. Fishermen question what they saw, even as they recount it. Daylight makes the bay feel familiar and forgiving. Yet those who have walked the flats at night never forget the feeling. The soundless movement of distant lights. The awareness of footsteps beside their own. The sense that the flats were not empty, but quietly attentive. Cape Cod Bay flats continue to reveal and conceal themselves with the tide. By day, they belong to the living. By night, under faint moonlight, they become something else entirely. A place where old paths glow briefly, where the ground remembers how people once walked it. And where, for a few silent steps at a time, no one ever truly walks alone across the exposed sand. Duxbury Flats stretch wide and low along the coastline, a vast expanse of wet sand that gleams like metal under open sky. At low tide the land seems endless, the horizon flattened until sea and ground blur together. Locals know the routes by instinct, reading subtle changes in texture and color, trusting memory more than markers. Even so, the flats demand respect. Fog arrives without warning here. One moment the air is clear, wind carrying the clean scent of salt and kelp. The next, visibility collapses. The fog does not roll in from the water or drift down from the dunes. It rises from the flats themselves, lifting off the sand in smooth, silent sheets. Within seconds, distance disappears. Sound dulls. Even experienced locals feel it. The fog presses close, reducing the world to a few steps in any direction. Landmarks vanish. Footprints fade quickly, swallowed by damp sand that smooths itself as if untouched. The sense of space narrows until movement feels risky, every step a decision. Visitors often describe the fog as heavy, not physically, but perceptually. Breathing seems louder. The flats, so open and wide moments earlier, become intimate and enclosing. Within the fog, shapes begin to form. At first they are simple variations in density, thicker patches where the mist gathers unevenly. Then edges appear. Vertical lines. Rounded contours. The fog shapes itself into human forms, standing still against the pale backdrop of sand and sky. They stand at varying distances, some near enough to feel close, others fading into the fog behind them. They do not move. Those who stop to watch feel a pull to remain still themselves. The figures hold their shape only briefly. A shift in air causes them to dissolve, their forms unraveling back into mist. Look away and another shape appears somewhere else, as if the fog is testing recognition. No two witnesses describe the same figure exactly. Some see tall shapes. Others see smaller forms. A few report clusters, standing as though gathered together. None report faces or features. The fog refuses detail. Sound behaves differently as well. Across the wet sand, noises travel farther than expected. A distant wave can sound close. A step taken feels amplified, echoing softly through the mist. At times, sounds arrive with no clear source, carried low and flat across the ground. Coughing is often heard. It comes suddenly, dry and strained, then stops. The sound seems to originate just beyond sight, close enough to cause concern, far enough to prevent response. Moments later, it may come again from a different direction, unchanged in tone and distance. Some hear whispered prayers. The words are indistinct, blurred by fog and air, but the cadence is recognizable. Soft, repetitive phrases carried on breath, never loud enough to understand fully. A cough follows silence. A whisper follows stillness. The flats seem to allow only one sound at a time, as though managing attention. Attempts to call out rarely produce results. Voices feel swallowed by fog, traveling only a short distance before fading. Shouting brings no reply, only a faint return of Oni's own voice, altered and distant. Time becomes difficult to judge. Minutes stretch. The sense of duration slips. Some visitors report walking for what feels like an hour, only to emerge from the fog moments after entering it. Others feel they have barely moved, yet later discover they have crossed a large section of the flats. Local history offers context, though not clarity. Duxbury Flats have long been a crossing point, a place used for travel when tides allow. Over the years, people have misjudged the fog, the tide, the distance. Stories of becoming lost circulate quietly, spoken without drama. The flats are not violent. They are indifferent. Some believe the fog remembers. They say the mist carries impressions of those who crossed here in uncertainty, their shapes forming briefly when conditions align. The coughing, the whispered prayers, they say, are echoes of moments when people paused, unsure, calling inward rather than outward. Others point to natural explanations. Temperature differences between wet sand and air. The way sound travels across flat, open surfaces. The human mind's tendency to impose meaning on vague stimuli. These explanations feel reasonable in daylight. In fog, reason thins. Those who experience the figures and sounds often describe a strong urge to follow, not toward any specific shape, but toward the idea that someone else is present. This urge is usually short-lived, countered by instinct and caution. Most choose to stand still, to wait for the fog to lift. And it always does. The fog retreats as quietly as it arrived, thinning at the edges, revealing sand and water inch by inch. Shapes dissolve. Sounds fade. Direction returns. The world resets as if nothing unusual occurred. Those who emerge from the fog often feel changed. They speak less. They move more carefully. They glance back more often than necessary. The experience lingers not as fear, but as awareness. Duxbury Flats remain beautiful and accessible, a place locals continue to cross and visitors continue to explore. On clear days, the danger feels abstract, the stories exaggerated. But when fog rises suddenly from wet sand, when shapes form and dissolve, when coughing and whispered prayers drift across the flats without source, the place reveals its other nature. A landscape that does not guide. A space that does not explain. A reminder that even familiar ground can become disorienting when vision fades, sound carries strangely, and the air itself seems to remember those who once stood still within it, listening, waiting, and hoping the fog would lift before the tide returned. Salem Sound flats stretch wide and low along the edge of the water, a landscape shaped by tide and patience. At low tide, the flats reveal shallow pools and dark ribbons of wet sand that mirror the sky. By day, the flats appear quiet and expansive. This place lies near waters heavy with history, where movement has always meant risk and return has never been certain. Gulls pass overhead. Wind traces faint lines across the pools. The air smells of salt and mud, clean and sharp. Footsteps sink slightly into the sand, leaving prints that fill with water and fade. Nothing about the scene demands attention, and that is often when it is noticed most. As evening approaches, the light changes. The sun lowers and spreads across the flats, turning shallow water into sheets of bronze and silver. Shadows lengthen and soften. Sound carries farther across the open space, unbroken by trees or walls. The flats feel larger now, more exposed, as if the land itself has pulled back. It is during these hours that figures are sometimes seen. They appear without warning, standing knee-deep in the shallow pools scattered across the flats. From a distance, they look like people pausing mid-journey. Their clothing seems old-fashioned, shaped differently than modern wear, heavier in cut and darker in tone. They do not move. They do not signal. They simply stand, facing the water or the shore. Those who see them often stop walking. The figures are clear enough to recognize as human, yet distant enough to feel unreal. Curiosity draws people closer. As distance closes, details blur. The air between observer and subject thickens. They do not fade gradually. They disappear all at once, leaving behind only the gentle disturbance of water. Ripples continue to spread across the pool, intersecting with the natural movement of the tide. No footprints remain. No splashes mark their departure. The water settles quickly. Those who reach the spot find nothing unusual. The pool is shallow and cold. Sand lies smooth beneath the surface. The ripples fade, and the flat returns to stillness, as if no one had ever been there. Local observers have seen this many times. Fishermen, walkers, and residents who know the tide speak of the figures calmly. They do not rush to explain them. They simply note that the sightings occur most often when the water is neither fully in nor fully out, during moments of transition. Historians point to the weight carried by these waters. Salem Sound has long been a place of passage. Ships departed and returned, sometimes damaged, sometimes not at all. People crossed the flats on foot during low tide, risking sudden changes in weather and current. What looks shallow and safe can become dangerous quickly here. Old records describe travelers misjudging the tide. Some became stranded far from shore. Others attempted crossings too late and were overtaken by rising water. In those moments, standing still in shallow pools may have felt safer than moving blindly forward. The flats remember that hesitation. Visitors who linger during twilight report a growing sense of awareness. The open space feels watched, not from any single point, but from the land and water together. The feeling is not hostile. It is observant, as if the place is paying attention to who enters and how they move. As if the place is paying attention to who enters and how they move. The figures appear most often when the flats are quiet. They are rarely seen during busy hours. They favor stillness, moments when the only sound is wind and distant water. They never appear in groups. Each stands alone, separated by distance, as if occupying a specific remembered spot. Some observers note differences. One figure may wear what looks like a long coat. Another appears cloaked or layered. No two sightings are exactly the same, yet all share the same posture. Upright. Waiting. Focused on the water rather than the shore. Approaching always ends the same way. The closer someone gets, the less solid the figure appears. The disappearance is immediate, leaving behind the subtle proof of ripples that could not exist without disturbance. Those ripples are often the only confirmation that something was there at all. Night deepens the mystery. Under moonlight, the flats take on a pale, reflective glow. Pools shine like dark mirrors. The horizon blurs, and distance becomes difficult to judge. Figures are harder to see now, but some insist they remain present, revealed briefly when moonlight strikes the water at the right angle. At night, the ripples linger longer. Water moves more slowly, unbroken by wind. The impression of standing shapes is replaced by the certainty that something has just left. The feeling remains even after nothing is visible. Scientists offer explanations rooted in perception. Light reflecting off water can create illusions. Mist and distance distort shape. The mind fills in gaps when context is incomplete. These explanations account for some sightings, but not for the consistency of details shared by those who have never spoken to one another. Nor do they explain the ripples. Maintenance of the flats reveals no unusual currents or hidden springs that could cause localized movement. The water remains calm unless disturbed. When ripples appear where figures vanished, they behave exactly as if something had been standing there moments before. Those who return often feel compelled to watch longer. They stand at the edge of the flats, scanning the pools, waiting without knowing why. Some describe a sense of recognition, as if the place feels familiar despite no personal connection. Others feel a quiet sadness that lifts once they leave. The flats do not hold people. They do not trap or mislead those who come prepared. The figures never approach the shore or follow anyone back. The flats slip beneath the surface, and any sign of disturbance is erased completely. By morning, Salem Sound flats look unchanged. The sand is smooth. The water reflects the sky. No trace of standing shapes remains. Daytime visitors cross the area without noticing anything unusual. Those who have seen the figures remember clearly. They recall the stillness. The old clothing. The quiet way the figures vanished when approached, leaving only ripples behind. Many return again, drawn by the feeling that the flats are not empty, but occupied by memory rather than presence. Salem Sound flats continue to exist between certainty and change. They lie open to the sky, shaped by tides that never stop moving. And in the moments when the water is shallow and the light is low, figures still stand knee-deep in the pools, silent and patient. The water smooths itself. And Salem Sound keeps what remains, holding history not in stone or structure, but in shallow pools that remember who once stood there, waiting for the tide to decide their fate. Ipswich River mouth flats stretch wide where fresh water meets the tide, a low expanse of silt and grass that shifts with every hour. At low tide the flats appear broad and open, a patchwork of darker channels and lighter ridges that look solid from a distance. The horizon feels close here, flattened by sky and water, with little to mark depth or scale. The mud is deeper than it looks. Locals know this well. The surface can support weight for a step or two, then give way without warning. Each footprint fills slowly with water, erasing the path behind. The ground does not break or splash. It yields quietly, drawing downward with a patience that feels intentional. During daylight, caution is enough to keep most people safe. Tides are watched. Routes are chosen carefully. Poles are used to test footing. Even so, the flats resist predictability. Channels shift after storms. Soft patches migrate. What held yesterday may not hold today. As the sun lowers, the character of the flats changes. Shadows stretch across the mud, blurring the difference between firm ground and deep silt. The waterline becomes harder to read. Sound travels oddly, carried and reshaped by the open space. Footsteps feel heavier, as if the ground is listening. People who venture too far report a strange sensation beneath their feet. The mud seems to tug downward. It begins subtly, like suction releasing slowly, then returning. A foot sinks an inch deeper than expected. Weight shifts. The ground responds by settling further, tightening its grip rather than loosening it. The sensation does not feel like slipping. It feels like being held. Those who experience it often freeze instinctively. Struggling makes the pull stronger. Calm movement reduces it slightly, but never fully removes it. The flats appear to respond to panic and patience differently. As though they recognize the difference. Some describe the feeling as hands beneath the surface, not grasping, but guiding weight downward. Others say it feels like the mud itself is breathing, expanding and contracting around legs and boots. The experience varies, but the direction remains the same. Most who encounter this manage to retreat carefully, stepping backward along tested ground. The effort leaves them shaken, aware of how quickly the flats can change from open space to trap. As evening deepens, another element emerges. Cries for help have been heard echoing across the flats long after sunset. The sound carries far in the open air, rising and falling with the wind. It is unmistakably human in tone, strained but controlled, calling out in brief bursts. The words are difficult to make out, stretched by distance and reflection. They appear once, then again minutes later, always from slightly different directions. Those who attempt to follow the sound encounter immediate difficulty. Distance is deceptive on the flats. What seems close remains far. The cries fade as attention focuses on them, returning only when movement stops. Shouting back produces no reply. Lights waved across the mud reveal only water and silt. The cries never answer questions or change tone. They exist independently, echoing across the flats without engaging those who hear them. Local knowledge offers context but no comfort. The river mouth has claimed lives over generations. Tides rise faster than expected. Fog rolls in without warning. Mud that seems stable becomes fluid with subtle changes in pressure and water content. Rescue attempts have been complicated here. Sound misleads. Distance collapses. Time becomes difficult to judge. Light fades. Footing demands constant attention. The flats do not forgive miscalculation. Yet the cries heard after sunset do not align with any known incident. They occur on nights without reported emergencies, when tides are favorable and access is limited. No missing persons are found. No evidence remains by morning. The flats return to quiet. Those who have heard the cries describe a deep unease rather than fear. The sound feels out of place, as if the land is replaying something it remembers rather than reacting to something happening now. The cries feel detached from time, carried by wind rather than lungs. Some believe the flats hold echoes of past struggles, released under certain conditions of tide and light. Others suggest the acoustics of the open mud create illusions, reshaping distant sounds into something more personal. Neither explanation fully accounts for the consistency of reports. The tug beneath the surface remains the most unsettling element. People who feel it often report the same detail. The pull intensifies when they look down. Focusing on the mud seems to invite it. Looking toward the horizon and moving deliberately reduces the sensation, though it never disappears completely until solid ground is reached. This has led to a simple rule among those who know the flats well. Do not linger. Do not fixate. Keep moving with care and awareness. At night, the flats feel wider than during the day, as if darkness stretches the distance between points. The horizon dissolves. Sound becomes the primary guide, and it cannot be trusted. Those who hear the cries and feel the pull often leave immediately, choosing caution over curiosity. The urge to help competes with the knowledge that assistance in the flats can quickly become another emergency. By dawn, the place reveals no trace of what occurred. The mud smooths itself. Channels rearrange. Footprints vanish. The river resumes its slow exchange with the sea, indifferent to memory. Ipswich River mouth flats do not announce danger with spectacle. They offer quiet warnings through sensation and sound. The downward tug is gentle but persistent. The cries are distant but compelling. Together, they create a place where attention and restraint matter more than strength or speed. The flats remind those who walk them that the ground is not always solid, and that the past does not always stay silent. In daylight, the area appears peaceful, a broad stretch of earth and water breathing with the tide. At sunset, it becomes something more complex, a landscape shaped by movement beneath the surface and voices carried by air. Those who listen carefully learn to respect the boundary. The flats do not chase. They do not threaten openly. They simply hold, release, and remember. And when the last light fades and the tide begins its slow return, the cries echo once more across the open mud. A reminder that some places keep the sound of struggle long after the struggle itself has passed. Barnstable Flats reveal themselves only when the tide pulls far enough away to expose a wide, pale stretch of sand that seems to go on without end. At low tide, the land opens outward from the shoreline in smooth, uninterrupted layers, reflecting the sky so clearly that the boundary between ground and horizon feels uncertain. During most visits, the flats appear calm and empty. A temporary landscape that exists only for a few hours before the sea returns. Yet when the tide is at its lowest, something unusual happens. The flats fall silent. No birds circle overhead. No calls echo across the open space. Even the distant sounds of water seem muted, as if absorbed by the sand itself. Wind that can be felt along the shoreline fades completely once a person steps farther out, leaving the air heavy and unmoving. Visitors often pause when they realize how quiet it has become. The silence is not gradual. It arrives all at once, pressing in from every direction. The vast openness that looked peaceful from shore now feels exposed, as though nothing remains to soften sound or distance. Footsteps become the only noise. Each step lands clearly, crisp against damp sand, leaving sharp impressions behind. The sound carries farther than expected, echoing lightly despite the lack of hard surfaces. Walking feels deliberate, each movement amplified by the absence of everything else. Then visitors stop. The silence returns for a brief moment, deep and complete. Breath sounds loud in the ears. The sense of isolation sharpens. And then the footsteps repeat. The sound comes from behind, matching the rhythm and weight of the steps just taken. One step. Then another. The pattern is exact, neither faster nor slower. It does not overlap the original movement. It follows it. Those who hear this often turn immediately, expecting another person on the flats. There is no one there. The sand behind remains undisturbed except for their own tracks. The repeated footsteps continue for several seconds, then fade as abruptly as they began. Many assume the sound is an echo, delayed by distance or air conditions. Yet the flats offer no structures to reflect sound. The surface is open and soft. There is nothing to send footsteps back. Those who walk again report the same experience. Their steps land. They stop. The sound returns, retracing their movement from behind as if played back. Some describe the repetition as quieter than the original steps, like a memory rather than a presence. Others say it feels closer, as though someone is walking just a few paces back, carefully matching stride. Local residents are familiar with the phenomenon. They say the flats behave differently when fully exposed. They say the silence is part of it, a necessary condition. According to them, the sound only repeats when nothing else moves, when the flats are left entirely to the person walking them. Where orientation was once difficult, relied on sound and visual cues to maintain direction. Without realizing it, though never formally recorded. Unsettled by the sensation of not being alone despite the emptiness. Those who linger longer on the flats report other subtle effects. Time feels stretched. Distances become harder to judge. What seemed like a short walk from shore grows longer with each step, while the return feels strangely compressed. The world reduces itself to sand, sky, and the sound of movement. When the footsteps repeat, they never continue indefinitely. They end without explanation, leaving behind the same heavy quiet as before. Some visitors test the phenomenon. They clap or call out. The sound dies quickly, absorbed rather than reflected. They stomp or drag their feet, then stop. The repetition follows, softer this time, but unmistakable. No additional tracks ever appear. The repeated footsteps leave no marks in the sand. Only the original impressions remain, clear and unbroken, leading forward without interruption. As the tide begins to turn, the silence slowly loosens its hold. A faint breeze returns. Distant birds reappear, their calls carried in uneven bursts. The repeated footsteps do not occur once water begins to move back across the flats. The phenomenon belongs only to the lowest tide. Those who experience it often describe a sense of being acknowledged by the place itself. Not threatened. Not warned. Simply noticed. The repetition feels like a reflection, as though the flats briefly mirror the presence moving across them. Psychological explanations suggest heightened awareness in open, silent spaces. The brain may replay recent sounds in the absence of new input. Auditory memory can feel external under certain conditions. Yet this does not explain why the sound aligns so precisely with movement, or why multiple people report the same sequence without prior discussion. Visitors who return to the flats at other times rarely encounter anything unusual. With birds present and wind moving, the place feels normal again. The silence does not settle. The repetition does not occur. Only when the flats are fully exposed and completely still does the experience return. Those who have heard their footsteps repeat rarely forget it. The sound carries a strange intimacy, like hearing oneself from outside. Creates the sensation of being both the walker and the follower, moving forward while something lags just behind. As the tide finally returns and water creeps back across the sand, all traces of movement disappear. Footprints soften and vanish. The flats close themselves again, erasing evidence of passage. Barnstable Flats appear unchanged, calm and ordinary, waiting for the next retreat of the sea. But when the tide falls low enough, and the world grows silent enough to listen, the flats respond. They take each step that crosses them, hold it briefly, and give it back. A quiet echo without reflection. Footsteps that follow, then stop. A reminder that in places where sound has nowhere to go, it sometimes turns around instead, returning not as a voice or a presence, but as the unmistakable sound of oneself, walking just behind, on land that remembers every movement until the water comes back to claim it. Monomoy Flats stretch outward from the narrow elbow of land where ocean and bay meet and argue with each other every day. Nothing here stays the same for long. Storms reshape the sandbars overnight. Channels appear and vanish between tides. What was solid ground one week becomes soft and uncertain the next. Maps struggle to keep up, and those who travel the flats learn quickly that memory cannot be trusted. By daylight, the landscape looks deceptively calm. Wide bands of pale sand curve toward the horizon. Shallow water glints between ridges. Seals rest at a distance, barely moving. From shore, it seems possible to cross safely if one simply watches the tide and moves carefully. But Monomoy has never been forgiving. Long before modern navigation, travelers and fishermen were stranded here when storms arrived faster than expected. Boats grounded on shifting shoals. Walkers found their return paths erased by rising water. Rescue was difficult, and sometimes impossible, when visibility dropped and the flats rearranged themselves beneath the wind. The storms are what define the place. Heavy weather does not just pass through Monomoy. It rewrites it. Sandbars break apart and reform. Mudflats soften and spread. What looks firm can become unstable without warning, pulling downward rather than supporting weight. It is after storms that the sightings occur. Travelers crossing the flats report seeing figures in the distance, standing on isolated sandbars that should not exist where they appear. The figures wave frantically, arms raised high, movements urgent and unmistakably human. At first, the instinct is to help. The figures appear stranded, separated by shallow channels or exposed mud. They stand far enough away to require effort to reach, but close enough to feel real. Those who see them describe a sudden rush of concern, paired with certainty that someone is in immediate danger. The figures do not speak. They wave continuously, as if time is running out. Their posture suggests exhaustion rather than panic, bodies leaning slightly forward, feet planted as though struggling to remain upright. When travelers move toward them, the figures begin to change. The waving slows. The arms drop slightly. The ground beneath the figures darkens, as if saturated. Step by step, the figures sink downward, not abruptly, but gradually, as though the sand itself is accepting them back. The motion is slow and controlled. No splashing. No struggle. Just a steady descent into mud that should not behave that way from a distance. The figures keep facing the approaching traveler until their shoulders dip beneath the surface. Then they are gone. No disturbance remains. The sandbar where they stood looks flat and empty, indistinguishable from surrounding ground. No footprints. No signs of collapse. Nothing to mark where a person should have been moments before. Those who witness this often stop in disbelief. The flats fall quiet again, broken only by wind and distant water. Local accounts describe similar sightings going back decades. Fishermen speak of seeing stranded people after storms, only to lose sight of them when navigating closer. Rescue attempts failed not because of distance, but because the location itself seemed to dissolve. Some believe the figures are illusions caused by shifting light and distance. Heat haze, fog, and reflective water can distort perception across wide flats. The brain fills in shapes, especially when primed by concern and isolation. But this explanation falters in the details. The figures wave with purpose. They react to movement. They sink only when approached, as if responding to attention rather than environment. The mud itself plays a role. Monomoy contains patches of fine sediment that behave unpredictably. After storms, waterlogged sand can appear solid while concealing deep, unstable layers beneath. Those who step onto such ground risk being pulled downward slowly, without dramatic collapse. The figures may reflect memories of those who misjudged the flats. Not as replayed events, but as impressions left by repetition. Each storm, each disappearance, each failed rescue adding to the sense that the land itself remembers what happens here. Those who see the figures often describe a heavy feeling afterward. Not fear, but weight. The flats leave behind the emotional residue of urgency without resolution. Within minutes, wind shifts or clouds pass, altering visibility. Those who remain standing are left questioning their own senses. They know Monomoy can create dangerous illusions. Many rescues have been complicated by people chasing what they thought were stranded individuals, only to become stranded themselves. Tide returns quickly. Channels fill without warning. Monomoy demands constant awareness, and punishes hesitation. They recall the frantic waving most clearly, the unmistakable signal of distress. They remember how real it felt, how wrong it felt to turn away even after the figures vanished. Some return to the flats searching for explanation. They walk the same routes, study the same sandbars, hoping to understand what they saw. The landscape offers no answers, only change. Storms continue to reshape Monomoy. Each season redraws its boundaries. Old paths disappear. New ones form. What was safe becomes dangerous, and what was dangerous may briefly appear calm. At low tide after heavy weather, the flats stretch farther than expected, exposing distant bars that tempt crossing. They wave. They wait. And when someone tries to reach them, they sink slowly into the mud, leaving no trace behind. Monomoy Flats remain a place where land and water refuse to commit to one form. They offer passage, then withdraw it. They show shapes that invite help, then erase them before help can arrive. Those who cross the flats learn to respect what they cannot control. Because here, storms do not just change the landscape. They awaken something in it. A memory of urgency, of people who stood on shifting ground and waited to be seen. And of a place that still raises its arms after the storm. Signaling silently across sandbars that are never quite real enough to save. Buzzards Bay Flats spread wide beneath an open sky where sea and land trade places with the tide. At low water, the flats stretch outward in long, glistening sheets of sand and shallow pools, reflecting moonlight like broken glass. By day, the space feels calm and expansive. At night, it becomes something else entirely. They appear low to the ground, hovering just above the flats, pale and unsteady. Some glow softly like lanterns seen through fog. Others flicker sharply, bright for a moment before dimming again. They are never high in the sky and never fixed in one place. Most people notice them from a distance first. Standing on the shoreline or watching from a boat, the lights seem harmless, even beautiful. They drift slowly across the flats, outlining channels and sandbars that vanish when the tide rises. Their reflections ripple across shallow water, multiplying and distorting until it is difficult to tell where the light ends and its mirror begins. This is where the debate begins. Some believe the lights are nothing more than reflections. Distant boats. Shore lights bending through humid air. Moonlight caught at the right angle on wet sand. The bay is known for tricks of light, especially on still nights when the air lies heavy and flat. Others are not convinced. They insist the lights move with intention. They say the glow does not follow the wind, but cuts against it, sliding sideways or advancing steadily into oncoming gusts. They describe watching the lights change direction suddenly, as if responding to something unseen. Those who have ventured onto the flats at night speak most carefully. Traveling across Buzzards Bay Flats requires knowledge and timing. Channels shift. Sandbars appear solid, then give way. The tide returns quickly, turning familiar paths into traps. Locals know to watch the water and trust memory more than sight. It is in these conditions that the lights become dangerous. Some travelers report seeing a light ahead and assuming it marks a safe route. A reflection, perhaps, or another person crossing the flats. They follow it, adjusting their course slightly, then more sharply as the light continues to move. The wind may be blowing hard from the west, yet the light drifts eastward. The discrepancy is subtle at first, easy to overlook in darkness. Over time, the mismatch becomes clear. The light is not being pushed. It is choosing its direction. Those who stop and watch notice another detail. The lights rarely move in straight lines. They curve gently, tracing arcs across the flats that seem to align with old channels rather than visible ones. At times, they pause, hovering in place, brightening slightly as if waiting. When followed, they tend to lead toward lower ground. Toward areas where the sand thins and water deepens. Toward channels that fill first when the tide turns. Toward spaces where footing becomes uncertain and escape grows harder. Not everyone who follows the lights reaches danger. Others are warned by sudden cold water at their ankles, a sharp reminder of how quickly conditions change. A few report hearing sounds near the lights. Soft splashing. A faint hum. The whisper of movement that does not match the wind. These sounds never grow louder. They remain just noticeable enough to draw attention without offering clarity. Those who abandon the lights often look back and find them gone. The flats return to darkness, broken only by stars and distant shoreline glow. It becomes difficult to explain why the lights felt so compelling moments earlier. Local history offers stories rather than answers. Buzzards Bay has long been a place of crossing and waiting. Fishermen, traders, and travelers moved across these flats when tides allowed, sometimes racing the water, sometimes misjudging it. The bay remembers these moments, locals say, holding on to patterns of movement long after the people are gone. They believe the lights are echoes. Not of individuals, but of routes. Old paths traced so many times they left an impression. The lights appear where movement once mattered most, where decisions were made quickly and consequences followed closely. Others believe the lights are warnings rather than lures. They argue that the lights do not guide people toward danger, but reveal it. That those who follow are misreading the signal, mistaking illumination for safety. In this view, the lights mark unstable ground, shifting channels, places to avoid. This interpretation does little to comfort those who have felt drawn toward them. What remains consistent across accounts is timing. The lights appear most often on nights when the tide is changing. When water creeps back across the flats, reshaping the landscape quietly. They rarely appear during full daylight or heavy storms. They prefer stillness, darkness, and moments of transition. Boaters report seeing the lights from offshore as well. From a distance, they appear closer to land than they are, compressing space and distorting judgment. Captains who steer by them find themselves off course, forced to correct sharply once instruments contradict what the eye believes. The lights do not reflect on radar. They do not register on equipment. They exist only to those watching directly. Attempts to film or photograph them produce mixed results. Some images show faint glows, easily dismissed as lens artifacts. Those who have encountered the lights often describe a lingering unease rather than fear. The feeling that something was guiding attention without concern for outcome. That the lights did not threaten, but also did not protect. They simply moved, following patterns independent of human need. Buzzards Bay flats remain open and familiar by day. Families walk the shoreline. Birds gather at low tide. The sand feels solid and reliable underfoot. At night, the rules change. The flats flatten depth and distance, turning simple paths into guesses. Wind masks sound. Water reflects light in misleading ways. In this environment, the strange lights gain power, not through force, but through suggestion. They offer direction where direction is hardest to judge. Those who trust them completely risk being led into places where the tide returns first, where the flats close behind without warning. Those who treat them with skepticism fare better, relying on memory, timing, and caution instead of glow. The lights do not chase. They do not call out. They do not insist. They simply move. And as long as Buzzards Bay flats continue to shift with the tide, as long as wet sand reflects moonlight and wind bends perception, the lights will continue to appear. Some will say they are reflections, nothing more than tricks of air and water. Others will insist they are something else, moving against the wind, tracing forgotten routes, guiding the unwary toward danger not out of malice, but indifference. The flats do not choose sides. They remain wide and quiet, waiting for night to fall, for water to turn, and for the first faint light to rise from the sand, drifting slowly across the bay, asking each observer to decide what they believe before taking the next step. Wellfleet flats stretch outward in all directions, an immense expanse of sand revealed when the tide retreats. At low tide, the flats seem endless, a pale horizon broken only by shallow channels and distant waterlines. The sky feels larger here, the land unusually exposed. People come expecting openness and calm. Many leave unsettled. The size of the flats is difficult to grasp. Walking across them feels like moving across a featureless map. Landmarks are scarce. Distance loses meaning. The shore behind grows small quickly, while the water ahead seems impossibly far away. Sound carries strangely in this open space, arriving late and without clear direction. During the day, the emptiness is striking but manageable. Sunlight reflects off wet sand, turning the ground into a vast mirror. Footsteps leave shallow impressions that vanish as water seeps back in. The flats feel neutral then, indifferent rather than hostile. Visitors explore, take photographs, and move on. As afternoon fades, something shifts. The light lowers and flattens, removing depth and contrast. The sand turns dull gray. Channels darken. The sense of scale becomes oppressive rather than impressive. People begin to feel exposed, as though standing in the open without shelter or boundary. It is in these moments that the emotions begin. Visitors report a sudden wave of sadness without cause. Not tied to memory or thought, but physical and immediate. A heaviness settles in the chest. Breathing feels shallow. Alongside sadness comes dread. Not fear of something specific, but an awareness that something is wrong. The flats feel too large, too empty, as if something essential is missing. Some experience mild discomfort that fades quickly. Others are overwhelmed, their mood changing so abruptly that it feels external, imposed rather than personal. The effect often grows stronger the farther one walks from the shore. Sound plays a role. In the vast quiet, small noises carry far. Wind brushing across sand can sound like movement. Water shifting in distant channels can resemble footsteps. And sometimes, far out across the flats, people hear something else entirely. Laughter. It is faint at first, light and distant, carried by the open air. The sound resembles children playing, their voices bright and carefree. It does not echo. It does not approach. It simply exists, suspended somewhere beyond clear distance. They listen carefully, trying to pinpoint the source. The laughter never seems closer or farther. Calling out produces no response, and walking toward the sound does not change its position. The sound of the laughter stops. The silence feels heavier than before. Dread sharpens, and visitors often feel an immediate need to leave. Local observers have heard these accounts for years. Fishermen, shell collectors, and long-time residents speak of the flats with quiet respect. They acknowledge the emotions and the sounds without embellishment. They know the tides and the risks. They also know the feeling of being too far out when the land seems to pull away. Wellfleet Flats have a long history. For centuries, people have crossed them on foot during low tide, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The flats can appear stable and safe, then change quickly. Weather shifts. Fog rolls in. Tides return faster than expected. What looks like a simple walk can become a test of endurance and direction. People lost their sense of scale and direction on the flats. The uniform surface made it difficult to judge distance. Sounds traveled unpredictably. Shouts for help sometimes carried away rather than toward others. Children were often warned about the flats. Stories were told to keep them close to shore, to prevent wandering too far. Laughter and play belonged near the beach, not across the open sand where distance could deceive. Over time, those warnings became part of local memory. Some believe the flats hold those memories. The sadness visitors feel may be an echo of uncertainty and loss layered over generations. The dread may arise from the instinctive recognition of vulnerability in such an exposed place. The laughter may be the mind filling silence with something familiar, something human. Yet the consistency of reports raises questions. People who have never heard these stories describe the same sensations. The same emotional weight. The same distant laughter that appears briefly and vanishes without explanation. Scientists studying sound on tidal flats note that temperature layers and wind can carry noises over great distances. Laughter from shore or boats can travel far and seem detached from its source. This explains some experiences. It does not explain why the sound feels directed. Those who hear the laughter often describe it as isolated, unconnected to any visible group or activity. The sound arrives cleanly, without background noise, then disappears completely. As evening approaches, the flats grow quieter still. The waterline creeps back slowly. Channels fill. Paths disappear. The sense of urgency increases as the tide returns, though the emotional weight often peaks before any real danger arises. Leaving the flats brings relief. The moment visitors step back onto the shore, the sadness lifts. Dread fades. Familiar sounds return. Looking back, the flats appear unchanged, wide and calm under the open sky. Many struggle to explain what they felt. They describe it as atmosphere rather than experience, a mood that belonged to the place rather than themselves. Some return again, curious to test the feeling. Others avoid the flats entirely after a single visit. Wellfleet Flats remain vast and empty. They stretch farther than expected, offering no shelter and few markers. The tide continues its steady rhythm, erasing and revealing the land with equal patience. And far out across the sand, in moments of stillness, some still hear laughter. Where no one stands, others feel a sudden sadness rise without reason. As if the flats themselves are remembering something that never fully settled. The place does not threaten. It does not pursue. It simply exists in its enormity, holding space for emotion as much as for water and sand. Wellfleet Flats remind those who walk them that emptiness can carry weight. That silence can speak. And that some landscapes affect the human spirit not through danger, but through the quiet, unsettling awareness of how small we are within them. Situate flats spread wide along the coast where land loosens its grip and gives way to tide and wind. Old maps tell a different story. Archived charts show crossings etched across the flats, narrow routes marked by names and measurements. These paths once guided fishermen, traders, and local travelers from one firm stretch to another. Over time the sea shifted, storms rearranged the ground, and the crossings vanished. During the day, the flats appear deceptively stable. Sand holds briefly, firm enough to suggest reliability. Footsteps leave shallow impressions that fade slowly as moisture rises from below. The surface looks readable, as though careful observation is enough to move safely across. That confidence rarely lasts. Travelers report seeing paths form ahead of them, subtle lines where sand appears more compact, slightly darker, as if pressed by repeated use. These paths curve gently across the flats, aligning naturally with the direction of travel. Stepping toward them feels reasonable. The paths often hold for several steps. The ground feels more solid beneath foot. Progress becomes easier. Then, without warning, the line dissolves. The sand loosens. The defined edge vanishes as if brushed away. What seemed like a route becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding flats. Looking back reveals no trace of where the path had been. Some describe watching the sand change even as they stand still. Edges blur. The surface smooths itself. The flats erase direction quietly, without drama or sound. As light lowers, the effect becomes more pronounced. Shadows stretch and blend, softening contrast. Channels reflect the sky unevenly, creating false impressions of continuity. In these conditions, paths appear more frequently and disappear more quickly. It is during these hours that voices are sometimes heard. They arrive softly, carried by wind and open space. The sound is low and close, as if spoken just behind the listener. The voices do not shout or call out urgently. The tone is calm and confident, offering guidance without pressure. The words feel specific, tailored to the moment. They suggest clarity where confusion has begun to form. Those who follow the whispered directions find that the guidance leads nowhere. A suggested turn brings them closer to water rather than firm ground. A promised rise remains flat. The path ahead dissolves again, leaving them no closer to safety or destination. The voices do not correct themselves. They do not acknowledge error. They do not acknowledge error. The whispers never repeat when questioned. Speaking aloud produces no response. The sound fades as attention shifts, returning only when movement slows and uncertainty grows. Many who hear the voices report a subtle change in awareness. Focus narrows. Peripheral vision becomes more active, catching movement that disappears when looked at directly. The flats feel larger, more open, as if the distance between points has expanded. Those familiar with the area rely on fixed landmarks beyond the sand. Distant buildings. Tree lines. Elevated ground that does not move with tide. They know that the flats themselves cannot be trusted to provide direction. The whispers contradict this knowledge, urging attention inward rather than outward. Some believe the phenomenon is entirely natural. Wind across uneven surfaces creates sound. Shifting light alters perception. The human mind fills gaps when reliable reference points disappear. In an environment that constantly changes, certainty becomes an illusion. Yet this explanation does not satisfy those who have experienced the same whispers, spoken in similar tones, offering guidance that feels intentional but proves useless. The old maps deepen the mystery. Routes once existed here. People crossed successfully, following paths now erased. The flats appear to offer those echoes back, not as reliable guidance, but as suggestion. This creates a dangerous balance. Trusting the ground feels reasonable. Distrusting it feels necessary. The whispers complicate that decision by offering confidence without accuracy. Those who spend too long searching for vanished paths often describe fatigue setting in quickly. The open space offers little variation. Time becomes harder to measure. Direction loses meaning. Most who encounter these effects retreat deliberately, using known markers to guide them back. The sensation of shifting paths fades. The flats return to quiet openness. By morning, there is no sign that anything unusual occurred. The sand lies smooth and undisturbed. Channels have moved again with the tide. Any temporary paths are gone. The danger lies in their subtlety. The ground offers hints without guarantees. The air carries suggestions without truth. Old maps preserve certainty that the land no longer honors. Paths drawn with care now lead into open sand. The flats have rewritten themselves too many times to accept fixed instruction. Those who walk here learn quickly that direction must come from outside the flats, not from within them. Trusting whispers, shadows, or temporary lines invites confusion rather than clarity. The land becomes uniform again, holding no evidence of where anyone walked or turned. Situate flats continue to exist between land and sea, shaped by forces that do not pause for memory or intention. Paths form and vanish. Voices whisper and fall silent. Directions lead nowhere. Those who respect the flats learn to move carefully, guided by what does not change rather than what appears in the moment. Those who listen too closely to the sand and wind find themselves turned around, standing in a place that looks familiar but offers no way forward. The flats do not trap through force. They mislead through suggestion. And when the light fades and the tide begins its slow return, the land settles back into quiet, leaving behind only the knowledge that some places cannot be crossed by following what seems to appear before your eyes. Marblehead Flats emerge slowly as the tide withdraws, revealing a fractured landscape of sand, stone, and shallow pools that mirror the sky in broken fragments. Close to the rocky shoreline, the flats feel less open than others along the coast. The ground is uneven, interrupted by dark outcrops and channels that twist toward the sea. Even in daylight, the place carries a sense of attention, as though the land itself is aware of being observed. At low tide, the flats stretch outward in irregular patterns. Water collects between stones, forming still pools that reflect clouds and passing light. The rocks rise like silent markers, worn smooth by centuries of waves. From a distance, the flats appear empty, calm, and exposed. Up close, they feel watched. Visitors often describe the sensation before noticing anything unusual. The instinct to look over one's shoulder. The feeling does not come with fear at first, only awareness, as if something has quietly registered their presence. As people move farther out, figures begin to appear. They stand between the pools of water, upright and motionless. The figures do not respond to movement or sound. Calling out produces no reaction. Walking closer does not change their posture. They remain still, watching without visible eyes. What unsettles most visitors is the silence that surrounds them. The flats near Marblehead are usually alive with sound. Gulls circle overhead. Water moves gently through channels. Wind carries the distant rhythm of waves breaking on stone. When the figures appear, these sounds fade. The air grows heavy. The only movement is the slow glint of light across water. People often test their vision, blinking or adjusting their angle, assuming the shapes are shadows cast by rocks. But the figures remain, clearly separated from their surroundings. They stand where no shadow should fall, in positions that do not align with the sun. Some visitors report that the figures appear clearer when not stared at directly. When attention softens, the outlines sharpen. When focused on too intently, they blur slightly, as if resisting being fully seen. Marblehead Flats have long been known as a difficult stretch of coast. The rocky shoreline creates unpredictable currents. Fog moves in quickly. Navigation has always required care. Historical accounts mention ships lost near these waters, their remains scattered and reclaimed by tide and stone. Fishermen once avoided the flats at certain times, claiming the place felt crowded even when empty. These beliefs were passed down quietly, rarely written, more caution than superstition. As the tide begins to return, the experience shifts. Water creeps back across the sand, filling channels and swallowing the pools one by one. The figures do not move. They remain standing as the water reaches their feet, then their knees, then their waists. Still, they do not react. Visitors who stay to watch describe a growing unease. The idea of leaving feels urgent, yet the figures hold attention. As the water rises, the sense of being watched intensifies, no longer passive but pressing, as though the flats are closing around the moment. When the tide reaches chest height on the figures, some appear to distort. Others remain sharply defined until the last moment. Then the water closes over them. They do not vanish with a splash or ripple. They are simply submerged, their dark forms visible for a few seconds beneath the surface, standing exactly where they were before. The water moves around them, indifferent. Those who witness this often turn away, compelled to leave. Walking back toward shore feels longer than expected. The rocks seem to shift slightly underfoot. The sound of returning water grows louder, as though urging departure. Some claim that even after the flats are fully submerged, the figures remain. They say that beneath the surface, visible only through rippling reflections, shapes can still be seen standing on the seabed. Not floating. Not drifting. Standing, patient and unmoving, as the tide resumes its claim. Once the water returns, the flats look ordinary again. Waves break gently over rock. The surface shows nothing beneath but shifting light and shadow. Yet those who have seen the figures insist the memory is different from imagination. The experience carries weight, not like a vision, but like a shared observation. Attempts to photograph the figures fail. Images show rocks, pools, and glare, but never the standing shapes as clearly as the eye perceived them. Video footage captures only subtle dark forms that could be dismissed as illusion. The feeling, however, remains consistent. Visitors describe leaving Marblehead Flats with a lingering sense of having interrupted something. The place does not feel dangerous, but it does feel occupied. The figures do not threaten. They do not pursue. They observe. Some believe the flats act as a threshold, a place where land and sea exchange more than water. According to this view, the figures represent moments caught between tides, held briefly before being submerged again. Others suggest the experience is shaped by the unique geography. Broken reflections, low angles of light, and isolation can create powerful impressions. The mind fills gaps when patterns repeat. Yet this does not explain why the figures always appear upright, always spaced apart, always still. Those who return to Marblehead Flats at different times often notice subtle changes. The watched feeling comes and goes. Sometimes nothing appears. Other times, the sensation alone is enough to send visitors back toward shore without knowing why. As evening falls and water settles back into its familiar boundaries, Marblehead Flats resume their quiet roll along the coast. Rocks glisten. Pools vanish. The land looks empty once more. But beneath the surface, according to those who have lingered too long, the figures remain. Standing where they always stood. Unmoving. Watching through water that cannot quite erase them. And when the tide retreats again, revealing the flats once more, the space between pools waits patiently. Ready to hold their shapes again, if only for a while, before the sea returns to cover them. And the watch continues unseen. Gloucester Flats lie where the harbor opens into wide, exposed ground. Revealed and reclaimed by the tide with steady patience. By day, the flats are busy in a quiet way. Mud glistens under the sun. Boats move along the channels with practiced ease. The land appears honest in its purpose. At night, the flats change. The smell deepens first. Salt grows heavier, layered with something older, something that lingers low to the ground. The tide pulls back, exposing long stretches of darkened sand and mud. Channels narrow. Water lies still in shallow pools that reflect little light. Sound carries far across the open flats, unbroken by structures or trees. Every movement feels amplified, every pause too quiet. It is during these hours that fishermen begin to notice boats that should not be there. Radar shows nothing. Modern equipment remains silent, screens empty of any signal that should mark another craft nearby. Yet the boats move slowly across the flats, following channels that exist only briefly before the tide returns. Some appear anchored in place. Others drift steadily, guided by strokes that cannot be seen. They do not display navigation lights. They do not respond to radio calls. They exist visually, but nowhere else. Fishermen who adjust course to investigate report the same outcome. The boats maintain their distance, never drawing closer, never falling behind. They remain just far enough away to observe, just close enough to feel intentional. Then the sound begins. The splash of oars echoes across the flats, rhythmic and measured. Each stroke is deliberate, entering and leaving the water with a sound too distinct to mistake for waves or debris. The oars are not visible. Only the sound carries, traveling across open mud and shallow pools. Arriving from directions that do not always match the position of the boats. Sometimes the splashing seems closer than it should be. Other times it feels distant, even when the silhouette appears near. The rhythm is steady. Not hurried. Not strained. It suggests routine rather than urgency. As if the act of rowing itself is the purpose, independent of destination. Those who stop engines to listen feel the silence press in around the sound. The flats absorb everything else. Wind drops. Water stills. Even birds seem absent. The oar splash becomes the only movement in a space that otherwise feels suspended. When fishermen move again, the sound fades. Not abruptly, but gradually, as though receding into memory rather than distance. The boats become harder to see, dissolving into shadow until nothing remains but empty flats and the smell of salt and decay. Local stories about Gloucester Flats stretch back centuries. Before engines and electronics, small boats worked these waters constantly. Oars were the primary means of travel, cutting through fog and tide alike. Many never returned, lost to sudden weather or misjudged channels that vanished beneath them. The flats were unforgiving. A wrong turn at low tide could leave a boat stranded far from open water. Rising tides could overwhelm those who waited too long. The harbor kept what it took, returning only fragments. Some believe the boats seen now follow old routes. Paths once reliable, now erased by shifting sediment. The silhouettes may mark channels remembered by the flats themselves, traced again when conditions align. The absence from radar reinforces the feeling that these boats are not fully present. They occupy space visually, but not physically. They move without disturbing water. They pass without leaving wake or ripple. They exist as impressions rather than objects. The sound of oars carries emotional weight. Fishermen describe it as calming at first, then unsettling. The repetition draws attention inward, making time feel stretched. Minutes pass unnoticed while listening, until awareness snaps back abruptly. Those who hear the oars often feel watched. Not directly, but with the sense that their presence has been acknowledged. The boats do not approach, but they do not flee either. The exchange feels silent and complete without interaction. Attempts to record the phenomena have limited success. Audio devices capture faint splashes mixed with ambient noise, never as clear as the sound heard directly. Video shows dark water and distant shapes that disappear under scrutiny. Nothing conclusive remains. The smell persists longer than the sight or sound. Even after the tide returns and the flats vanish beneath water, fishermen report catching traces of that heavy scent far out in the harbor. Those who work the flats regularly develop habits. They avoid certain channels at night. They do not chase distant boats. They listen, acknowledge the sound, and continue on their way without comment. The flats seem to reward restraint. Those who linger too long report disorientation. Distance becomes difficult to judge. Familiar markers shift subtly, making return paths feel uncertain. Once daylight returns, Gloucester Flats appear unchanged. Mud dries. Birds return. Boats move visibly and predictably. The harbor resumes its ordinary rhythm, offering no hint of what passed through during the night. Yet the stories remain consistent. The unseen boats. The absent radar signals. The steady splash of oars crossing empty ground. Gloucester Flats occupy a space between harbor and open sea, between presence and absence. They are shaped by tide, weather, and memory in equal measure. At night, when the flats are exposed and the air grows heavy with salt and decay, something moves across them quietly. Boats that do not register. Oars that splash without bodies. Routes that no longer exist, traced once more across mud that remembers where water used to be. Those who hear the sound understand instinctively not to follow. Because here, the flats do not reveal everything they hold. They only allow brief glimpses, offered in silence and shadow, before the tide returns and carries the rest back into the dark water where it has always belonged. Nantucket Sound Flats open wide at low tide, a pale expanse of sand and shallow water stretching toward islands that hover faintly on the horizon. The distance looks manageable. The ground appears firm. The flats invite movement. Walking here feels effortless at first. The sand is packed tight by retreating water, smooth and reflective in places, textured in others. Shallow channels cut across the flats in gentle curves, no deeper than an ankle, easy to cross without hesitation. The air smells clean and open, salt and wind blending into something calming. Visitors often underestimate how far they have gone. With no landmarks nearby and the horizon flattened by water and light, distance becomes difficult to judge. Each step feels small, progress subtle. The islands ahead seem no closer after long minutes of walking, yet turning back reveals the shoreline farther away than expected. As the tide begins to rise, the flats change character. Water returns quietly, sliding across the sand in thin sheets rather than waves. Channels widen and deepen almost imperceptibly. What was dry moments ago becomes damp, then slick, then reflective again. The transition is smooth enough to escape notice until shoes grow heavy and cold creeps upward. It is during this shift that many describe a strange sensation. A pull. Not physical, not forceful, but persistent. Visitors feel drawn toward the water rather than away from it. The direction feels natural, intuitive, as though moving seaward makes more sense than retreating to land. The islands ahead, faint and distant, seem to offer orientation, a destination in a space that otherwise lacks one. Those who notice the feeling often stop. Standing still breaks the illusion briefly. Awareness returns. The tide can be seen advancing, slow but steady. Logic asserts itself. Yet the pull remains, subtle and patient, returning the moment attention drifts. Some take another step forward without realizing it. The wind across Nantucket Sound is rarely silent. It moves constantly, changing speed and direction as weather shifts offshore. Normally it carries the sound of waves, birds, distant boats. Occasionally, something else rides the air. Chanting. It arrives faintly, barely distinguishable from the wind at first. A low rhythm, repeated and steady, rising and falling with each gust. The sound carries across the flats without a clear source, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Those who hear it describe different impressions. This is the end of the script. Some hear voices layered together, many speaking in unison. Others hear a single tone repeated, simple and continuous. The sound is never loud. It does not demand attention. It blends with the wind just enough to remain ambiguous. Listening closely sharpens it. The chanting does not resolve into words. It remains a pattern rather than a message. A cadence without language, familiar in structure even if unfamiliar in meaning. The rhythm feels old, patient, unconcerned with time. The sound seems strongest when the tide is in motion. As water creeps higher, the chanting grows slightly clearer, then fades again, never reaching full presence. Those who follow the sound often report losing track of time. Minutes stretch without sensation. The flats feel endless, the islands unchanged in distance. The pull toward the water intensifies subtly, encouraging forward movement even as footing grows less certain. Shallow channels become knee-deep before being recognized as such. Sand that once felt solid loosens, shifting underfoot. The rising tide rearranges the landscape quietly, erasing paths behind without drama. Locals warn against walking too far out for this reason. They speak of how easy it is to misjudge the tide here, how the sound seems to flatten urgency, how the flats offer no resistance until it is too late. The stories are practical, not theatrical, passed as advice rather than legend. Yet even locals admit something about Nantucket Sound flats feels different. They acknowledge the pull, though they rarely name it. Historical accounts describe these flats as crossings rather than destinations. People moved across them when conditions allowed, following the tide, watching the sky, trusting experience. The sea here has always demanded attention, rewarding patience and punishing assumption. Some believe the chanting is nothing more than wind interacting with water and open space. They argue that the mind fills in patterns where none exist, especially in environments that lack clear reference points. The sound, they say, is a trick of air pressure and expectation. Others believe the flats hold memory. They say the chanting echoes moments when people moved together across this space, timing their steps with the tide, speaking or singing to maintain rhythm and morale. Over time, these patterns impressed themselves onto the landscape, repeating when conditions align. The idea persists because the experience feels shared. Different visitors, separated by years, describe similar sounds, similar timing, similar sensations of being drawn outward as water returns. Those who manage to turn back often do so abruptly. A sudden awareness breaks through the calm. A glance at the water reveals how much has changed. The chanting fades as attention shifts. The pull weakens, replaced by urgency. Walking back feels harder than going out. The sand softer, the water colder. Reaching dry ground brings immediate relief. The sound disappears completely. The wind resumes its ordinary voice. The islands look distant again, clearly separated by water. Time snaps back into alignment, minutes and hours making sense once more. Looking back across the flats, nothing appears unusual. The water moves quietly. The sand gleams under light. There are no figures, no markings, no sign of what was felt or heard. The place looks calm and inviting, just as it did before. Those who have experienced the chanting rarely speak of it casually. They describe it carefully, aware of how easily it could be dismissed. A memory lingers not as fear, but as caution. A reminder that this landscape operates on its own terms. Nantucket Sound flats remain open and beautiful, a place of shifting light and wide horizons. By day, they offer space and calm. By night or during rising tide, they reveal their other nature. A place that draws the eye forward while quietly changing beneath the feet. A place where wind carries more than weather. And sometimes, when water begins its return. When islands blur at the edge of sight. A place where chanting rides the air. Steady and patient. Reminding those who hear it that not every invitation is meant to be followed. Provincetown flats stretch outward like a sheet of polished glass when the tide pulls back, revealing a surface so smooth it feels unreal. At low tide, shallow water coats the sand in a thin reflective layer, turning the flats into a mirror that catches every change in the sky. By day, the effect is striking but harmless, a visual curiosity shaped by light and water. At dusk, it becomes something else. The sky shifts through layers of gold, violet, and gray, and the sand reflects it back with unsettling precision. Horizon lines blur. Distance becomes difficult to judge. The boundary between ground and sky thins until it feels as though the flats are suspended between two worlds. People walking at this hour slow their pace. Footsteps ripple the water slightly, but the surface settles almost immediately, restoring the reflection. Looking down feels like looking up. Clouds appear beneath the feet. The effect is disorienting but captivating, drawing attention inward and outward at the same time. It is during this transition that the reflections change. At first, people see their own shapes mirrored clearly beneath them, as expected. A second silhouette follows each movement precisely. Arms lift and lower. Heads turn. Everything aligns. Then, without warning, the reflection hesitates. A step is taken forward, but the reflected figure lags behind. Another step, and the reflection moves sideways instead of straight. The discrepancy is subtle at first, easy to dismiss as uneven water or shifting light. But as people stop and test the movement, the reflection continues on its own. Those who witness this often freeze. Looking down, they see themselves standing still, while the reflection takes another step, or turns slightly, or lifts an arm that has not moved. The reflected figure remains perfectly shaped, perfectly familiar, yet no longer obedient to motion above. The sensation is deeply unsettling. People describe a sudden tightening in the chest, a feeling of separation without distance. The reflection feels close, yet unreachable, as if existing just beneath the surface rather than within it. Some try to correct the movement. They step sideways or wave their arms, attempting to bring the reflection back into sync. Sometimes it responds. Sometimes it does not. Others look away instinctively. When they look back, the reflection has returned to normal, mimicking their stance exactly. The effect does not last long. As dusk deepens and light fades, the reflections grow less distinct. Colors flatten. Detail drains from the surface. The independent movement becomes harder to see, then impossible to confirm. When night falls, the reflections vanish entirely. The flats lose their mirror quality. Sand and water darken into uniform shadow. Footsteps become audible again. The sky separates cleanly from the ground. Whatever was present during dusk leaves no trace. Those who experience the reflections struggle to explain them. They describe the moment as brief but vivid, more sensation than sight. Some question their perception afterward. Others are certain of what they saw, despite lacking evidence. Others are certain of what they saw, despite lacking evidence. Local observers are familiar with the stories. They speak of dusk on the flats with caution, noting that the timing is precise. The phenomenon does not occur in full daylight or total darkness. It belongs to the narrow window where light is low but not gone, where reflection is strongest and depth is hardest to judge. Scientists explain the flats as a perfect natural mirror. A thin layer of water on compact sand creates a reflective surface capable of producing mirage effects. Light bends. Perspective shifts. Reflections can appear displaced or delayed due to uneven surfaces and subtle currents. These explanations account for visual distortion. They do not fully account for the feeling of agency. Those who see the independent reflections often describe them as intentional. The movement feels deliberate rather than random. The reflection does not distort or blur. It moves cleanly, clearly, as if guided by its own awareness. Some describe a sense of recognition. The reflected figure feels familiar beyond appearance. It seems to know the person it mirrors. The separation feels personal, not abstract, as though something essential is being briefly revealed rather than created. The flats have long been a place of crossing. At low tide, people have walked these sands to reach distant points. Travelers have navigated by sight and instinct, often relying on reflection and horizon to maintain direction. The flats reward attention and punish distraction. Old accounts describe people losing their sense of orientation. Reflections confused depth. Sky and ground blended. People mistook direction and wandered in widening arcs without realizing it. The flats were not dangerous by intent, but by indifference. Perhaps the reflections echo that uncertainty. Standing on the flats at dusk, people are confronted with a version of themselves that does not fully align. A reminder that perception can split, that certainty can fracture under the right conditions. Those who return often try to recreate the experience. They arrive at the same time of day, walk the same paths, watch their reflections carefully. Most see nothing unusual. A few notice subtle delays or shifts that may or may not be real. The phenomenon does not repeat on command. It arrives without warning and leaves just as quietly. There is no pattern to who sees it. Some notice it once and never again. Others return many times without success. Night always ends it. Once darkness settles, the flats become ordinary once more. The surface absorbs light instead of reflecting it. The mirror breaks. Any sense of separation disappears. People leave the flats feeling relieved. The unease fades quickly, replaced by the familiar comfort of solid ground and clear boundaries. Yet the memory of the reflection lingers, sharper than expected. Some dream of it later. They dream of standing still while something identical moves away. Of watching themselves from a distance they cannot close. The dreams fade with waking, but the impression remains. Provincetown flats continue to reflect the sky as they always have. At dusk, the sand still turns to mirror. Colors still deepen. Boundaries still blur. Most people see only beauty in the effect. But some, in that narrow band of fading light, see more. They see reflections that hesitate, then move on their own. Versions of themselves that exist only briefly, bound to water and light. And when night falls and the reflections vanish, they are left with the quiet understanding that for a moment, the flats revealed not just the sky, but the fragile alignment between who we are, and what we believe we see. Hingham Flats stretch outward where the shoreline loosens into open sand and shallow water, a broad plain shaped by tide and weather. At low tide the flats appear welcoming, a wide expanse of pale ground broken by ripples, channels, and scattered pools that reflect the sky. From a distance it looks calm and manageable, a place where the sea seems to step back and allow passage. That calm has always been deceptive. The flats sit exposed to sudden changes in weather. Storms can arrive quickly, driven in from open water with little warning. Wind flattens the surface. Rain erases familiar markers. The tide, already moving beneath the sand, accelerates its return. Over the years, these shifts have claimed many lives, not through spectacle, but through timing and misjudgment. Most incidents followed a similar pattern. A clear sky. A routine crossing. Then a rapid change that turned firm ground into moving water. Paths vanished. Pools deepened. Distance expanded. The flats offered no shelter, only open space and confusion. During daylight, the history feels distant. The sand holds footprints briefly before smoothing itself again. Water glides through channels with quiet purpose. The horizon remains steady. Visitors walk out with confidence, watching the sky, trusting the stillness. It is during calm weather that the most unsettling experiences are reported. On days when the air is clear and the water barely moves, some visitors hear shouting across the flats. The voices sound urgent and close, raised as if calling to someone just out of sight. The words blur with distance, but the emotion is unmistakable. Alarm without chaos. A need to be heard. The shouting does not match the conditions. There is no wind to carry sound so sharply. No visible movement to explain the urgency. Looking across the flats reveals empty sand and shallow water. No figures run. No groups gather. The voices echo briefly, then fade. Moments later, frantic footsteps are sometimes heard. They sound hurried and uneven, as if someone is running across wet sand, splashing through shallow pools. The rhythm is irregular, suggesting panic rather than purpose. The sound travels quickly, crossing open space without revealing a source. Those who turn toward the noise often feel their attention pulled outward, scanning for movement that never appears. The flats remain empty, the surface unchanged. The footsteps end abruptly, as if swallowed by distance. The effect leaves a lingering tension. Visitors describe an urge to move, to leave the area, even when nothing visible threatens them. The calm weather feels less reassuring after the sounds fade, as though the flats are replaying something that does not belong to the present moment. Another detail adds to the unease. Cold water pools dot the flats, shallow in appearance but surprisingly deep. These pools form where channels intersect or where sand settles unevenly. Their edges are smooth and gradual, giving little indication of depth. Stepping into one can bring sudden cold well above the ankle or knee. The temperature difference is striking. The water feels unnaturally cold compared to the surrounding shallows, as if drawn from deeper layers beneath the sand. The chill arrives instantly, numbing and heavy, making movement slower and more deliberate. Some who step into these pools report a sensation of depth that does not align with what they see. The water seems to pull downward, extending below expected limits. Even when footing is found quickly, the impression of depth lingers, as if the pool continues beneath the surface beyond what the body encounters. These pools appear and disappear with the tide, shifting location over time. Local knowledge emphasizes caution, especially during clear weather when vigilance relaxes. Experienced walkers move deliberately, testing ground and avoiding direct paths across open sand. They know that storms are not the only danger here. The sounds heard during calm conditions are often dismissed as wind or distant activity. Yet the consistency of reports challenges easy explanation. Shouting with no source. Footsteps with no movement. Cold pools that feel deeper than they should. Some believe the flats hold memory rather than presence. The area has witnessed moments of intense urgency, voices raised against wind and water, feet running across ground that was vanishing beneath them. These moments ended abruptly, leaving the land to absorb what followed. The flats may release these impressions under certain conditions, when the surface is quiet enough to allow them through. Others suggest the acoustics of open sand and shallow water create illusions, bending sound and distance until it feels personal. Calm air can carry noise farther and more clearly, reshaping it into something more immediate than it truly is. Neither explanation fully accounts for the physical sensations reported near the cold pools. The sudden depth, the heavy chill, the feeling of downward pull combine with sound to create an experience that feels coordinated rather than random. Importantly, the flats do not escalate these encounters. The shouting does not approach. The footsteps do not circle. The pools do not expand visibly. Each element appears briefly, then releases its hold, leaving visitors unsettled but unharmed. Those who leave the flats often describe relief rather than fear. The sensation fades quickly once solid ground is reached. The sounds do not follow. The cold remains only as memory. By evening, the flats return to stillness. Pools fill and empty. Any trace of footsteps, real or imagined, disappears. The area offers no sign of what was heard or felt. Hingham Flats continue to draw people during fair weather. Their openness inviting exploration. The danger lies not in constant threat, but in sudden change and subtle cues that are easy to ignore. The shouting heard during calm moments does not warn of immediate danger. It reminds listeners of what has happened before, of how quickly conditions can turn. The frantic footsteps echo urgency without offering direction. The cold pools serve as quiet tests of attention, revealing how much lies beneath the surface that cannot be judged by sight alone. Together, these elements shape a place that feels calm while holding the weight of past storms. The flats do not seek to frighten. They reflect what they have witnessed, releasing fragments of experience into still air and cold water. Those who walk here learn to listen without following, to observe without assuming. The safest crossings are made with respect for the land's unpredictability and awareness that silence does not always mean safety. As the tide returns and the sky darkens, Hingham Flats reclaim their familiar shape. Yet for those who have heard the shouting in calm weather, or felt the depth of a cold pool where none seemed possible, carried by sound and sensation rather than sight, they stand as a reminder that some landscapes hold more than they show, and that calm conditions can still carry echoes of urgency, waiting to be heard by those who pause long enough to listen. The ground appears firm, marked by shallow ripples left behind by retreating water. From the edge of town, the flats look like an invitation to walk straight into the past. Long before modern roads traced the coast, old trade routes crossed this exposed land. Merchants and farmers once used the flats as a shortcut, guiding wagons across at low tide to move goods between settlements. Timing mattered. The crossing had to be completed before the sea returned. Those routes faded as bridges and roads replaced them. The wagons disappeared, and the flats returned to quiet, visited only by birds and the occasional traveler who knew when the tide would allow safe passage. Yet something remains. Visitors walking across Newburyport Flats during low tide sometimes pause when they hear a sound that does not belong. It begins faintly, barely noticeable at first. A low, rhythmic rolling that seems to travel across the sand itself. As attention sharpens, the sound becomes clearer. Wagon wheels. The noise is unmistakable. Wood against sand. A steady rotation. The subtle creak of an axle carrying weight. The sound does not rush or stumble. It moves at a measured pace, following a straight line across the flats. Those who hear it often stop walking, listening carefully. The sound continues, even after they stand still. It does not echo. It does not fade with distance the way normal sound should in such an open space. It simply rolls on, consistent and deliberate. Looking around reveals nothing. The flats remain empty. No tracks appear in the sand beyond the visitor's own footprints. The sound travels from one direction to another, as though following a route that once existed. Some report hearing it pass behind them. Others say it moves parallel to their path, always just out of sight. As the tide begins to turn, the experience deepens. The experience deepens. Water creeps back across the flats, filling shallow channels and softening the sand. The sound of wagon wheels does not stop. Even as waves begin to lap gently over the ground, the rhythm remains steady. The present and the past seem to overlap. The sound carries weight, as though something substantial is moving through space that no longer supports it. Those who linger too long report hearing more than one set of wheels. The rolling overlaps briefly, then separates, suggesting multiple wagons traveling together. The sounds do not collide or tangle. They maintain spacing, like a caravan following a familiar path. Local historians note that trade across the flats often happened in groups for safety. Travelers timed their crossings together, sharing knowledge of tides and routes. Losing the path could mean disaster if the water returned too quickly. The persistence of the sound, even as the tide rises, unsettles many who hear it. Logic suggests the noise should be drowned out by water or carried away by wind. Instead, it remains clear, sometimes growing louder as the sea closes in. Some visitors report that the sound changes slightly once the water reaches ankle height. The rolling becomes muted, as though heard through distance or memory. Yet it does not disappear. It continues beneath the sound of water, maintaining its rhythm long after the flats should be impassable. Those who turn back toward shore often notice the sound fading gradually, as if the wagons are continuing onward without them. Others say the noise follows them for a short distance, then abruptly stops once solid ground is reached. Historical records describe incidents of wagons lost to the tide. Sudden changes in weather or misjudged timing could trap travelers on the flats. Some accounts mention goods abandoned in haste, left behind as water rose too fast to allow safe recovery. No official records mention hearing sounds after such events. Yet oral histories passed through families speak of nights when rolling could be heard from shore, long after wagons had ceased to cross. Skeptics suggest natural explanations. Wind moving across wet sand can produce low sounds. Water shifting beneath the surface can resonate in unexpected ways. The mind may fill gaps with familiar patterns when attention is focused. But these explanations do not account for the detail of the sound. Those who hear it consistently describe the same elements. The creak. The rotation. The steady pace. Nor do they explain why the sound follows old trade routes rather than random paths across the flats. Visitors who experience the phenomenon often leave with mixed emotions. The sound does not feel threatening. It feels purposeful. Like work continuing without acknowledgement of time passing. Some describe a quiet sadness in the experience, as though the sound carries the weight of effort repeated too many times to fade. Others feel awe at the idea that the land remembers what crossed it, replaying those moments when conditions align. As the tide fully returns and the flats disappear beneath water, the sound eventually fades. It does not end abruptly. It slows, softens, and then dissolves into the rhythm of the sea. By the time the water settles, nothing remains. No tracks. No evidence. Only the memory of sound moving across empty space. During the next low tide, the flats appear unchanged. Smooth sand. Shallow channels. Open sky. There is no sign of the old routes beyond faint lines visible only to those who know where to look. Yet those who have heard the wagon wheels listen more closely when they return. They pause. They stand still. They wait. Sometimes, when the flats are fully exposed and the air is calm, the sound returns. Wheels rolling steadily across sand. A crossing repeated without end. A reminder that Newburyport Flats were once a place of movement and labor, where timing mattered and paths were carved not in stone, but in memory. And even as the tide rises to erase every trace, the sound carries on a little longer, echoing across water that cannot quite silence the passage of those who once depended on the flats to reach the other side. Rockport Flats spread out where the coastline breaks into uneven stone and shallow pools, a place shaped by erosion and patience. At low tide, the water pulls back to reveal a maze of slick rock and narrow channels. Sharp edges hide just beneath the surface, invisible until stepped on. Even in calm weather, the flats demand attention. By day, the danger is practical. Sunlight glints off wet stone. Small waves slip quietly between rocks. The flats feel exposed and honest, a working shoreline where care matters more than comfort. At dusk, the character of the place begins to shift. Light drains slowly from the water, leaving the rocks darker and more pronounced. Shadows stretch across the pools, blurring depth and distance. The sound of the sea grows heavier, each wave arriving with more weight than before. It is during these hours that figures are sometimes seen. They appear low to the ground, kneeling near the tide pools as if searching for something lost among the stones. Their posture suggests focus rather than rest. Heads bowed. Hands close to the water. Bodies still except for small, deliberate movements. From a distance, they look real. Their shapes match the scale of the flats. They occupy places where someone could kneel safely, just beyond the reach of the waves. Those who notice them often assume they are other visitors, shell collectors, or fishermen checking traps. The illusion holds until it does not. As observers draw closer, details remain indistinct. Clothing cannot be clearly identified. Faces never turn toward the shore. The figures seem absorbed in their task, unaware of being watched. Then the water changes. A larger wave rolls in, spreading across the flats in a thin sheet. The pools fill and connect briefly, smoothing the broken surface. When the water recedes again, the figures are gone. No sign they were ever there. No footprints on the wet rock. No disturbance in the pools. No movement away from the area. The stone returns to its quiet state, unchanged. Those who witness this often stop in place. The disappearance feels too complete. Too sudden. The mind searches for explanation, replaying the moment to find where the figures could have gone. Fishermen, walkers, and coastal workers describe seeing kneeling forms near the pools at twilight or during overcast days when light is flat and color drains from the landscape. No one reports seeing them stand. The posture never changes. Light can behave strangely across shallow water and rock, bending shapes and creating illusions that disappear with movement. But this explanation fails to satisfy those who have watched closely. The figures maintain shape even as light shifts. They remain visible when reflections elsewhere fade. They kneel in places that do not reflect sky or shore, occupying physical space rather than surface glare. Others believe the figures are searching. Rockport Flats have claimed much over time. Tools dropped into pools. Nets snagged and lost. Personal items swept away by sudden waves. The sea takes quietly here, leaving little chance of recovery. The kneeling figures appear to repeat that act of searching, as if bound to the flats by unfinished effort. They look for something specific, yet never find it. The sharp rocks add to the unease. Those who walk the flats know how easily injury can occur. A misstep can break skin. A fall can pin someone against stone as water rises. The environment offers no softness, no forgiveness. Seeing figures kneel among those rocks feels wrong. It suggests familiarity with danger, or indifference to it. People who attempt to approach more closely often feel resistance. Not physical force, but hesitation. A sudden awareness of the water level. A reminder of footing. Attention shifts to safety, and when it returns to the figures, they are already gone. The timing always aligns with the waves. Even small surges are enough. The water does not need to crash or roar. It simply has to move forward, touch the space where the figures kneel, and reclaim it. Once covered, the figures do not reappear. They do not stand up. They do not move away. They are absorbed into the returning sea as if they were part of the flats themselves. Some locals believe the figures represent memory rather than presence. An echo of those who once knelt here in real need, searching tide pools for tools, for food, for a way out of worsening conditions. The flats remember those moments and replay them when light and water align. Others feel the figures are warnings. A reminder of how quickly conditions change. How easily attention can narrow while danger approaches. The kneeling posture draws focus downward, away from the horizon and the incoming tide. Those who notice the figures often check the water instinctively. They move to higher ground. They become aware of time passing. In that sense, the sight may serve a purpose, even if its origin remains unclear. The figures never appear in full darkness. They belong to the space between day and night, when depth becomes uncertain and edges blur. Once night fully settles, the flats empty again, occupied only by rock and water. Morning erases all trace. Sunlight restores clarity. Pools sparkle. Rocks dry. The flats look exactly as they should, offering no hint of what appeared there hours earlier. Visitors return, walk familiar paths, and dismiss stories as exaggeration. Yet those who have seen the figures recognize the conditions instinctively when they return. A certain quality of light. A certain stillness before the wave. Rockport Flats remain a place of careful movement and quiet danger. Sharp rocks hide beneath shallow water. The sea advances and retreats without concern. And sometimes, just before the water returns, figures kneel beside the pools, searching patiently among stone and reflection. Until the next wave rolls in and takes them back, leaving the flats empty once more. Sandwich Flats lie low and wide along the coast, a pale field of sand that stretches outward when the tide retreats. By day the flats feel open and manageable, a place where wind sweeps freely and the ground appears firm enough to trust. The horizon stays level, the sea distant, the land uncomplicated. It is easy to believe you can read this place at a glance. It moves quickly across Sandwich Flats, faster than most expect. One moment the air is clear, the next the world shrinks to a few body lengths in every direction. The fog does not creep in gently or announce itself with cooling air. It arrives as a wall that slides sideways, cutting off landmarks and flattening sound until everything feels close and far at the same time. Experienced locals know to turn back when it comes. They recognize the way the fog schemes low over wet sand, hugging the surface as if guided by it. They watch how the light dulls instantly, how distance collapses, how even familiar paths lose definition. Those who hesitate often regret it. Within the fog, movement appears. At first it looks like shifting mist, a thicker band forming ahead where the fog gathers unevenly. Then shapes begin to separate from the haze. Upright figures, human in outline, arranged not singly but in groups. They walk toward the sea. The figures move at a steady pace, evenly spaced, their steps synchronized without sound. People who witness this often freeze. The scene feels deliberate, orderly, too coherent to dismiss as illusion. They do not rush or wander. They move as if following a shared purpose, one that does not require speech or acknowledgement. No sound accompanies them. No footsteps. No rustle of clothing. No splash from shallow water. The fog absorbs everything, leaving only the visual impression of motion. Those who step closer notice another detail. The sand beneath the figures remains undisturbed. Even in wet areas where footprints should be obvious, no marks appear. The surface stays smooth, reflective, untouched. The absence unsettles observers more than the sight itself. Footprints are proof. Without them, the mind struggles to place what it sees within normal experience. Some blink and look again, expecting the shapes to dissolve. Others watch until the figures fade naturally into thicker fog, leaving the flats empty once more. The fog rarely holds still long enough to allow study. It shifts constantly, opening brief windows of clarity before closing again. A group may be visible for only seconds, then gone, swallowed by moving air. Those seconds feel longer than they are, stretched by attention and uncertainty. Different witnesses report different numbers. Some see a handful of figures. Others see many, extending in a line that vanishes into fog. A few describe groups appearing in waves, one after another, always heading seaward, always silent. No one reports the figures turning back. The flats themselves offer no evidence afterward. Once the fog lifts, the sand appears as it always does, smoothed by moisture and wind. No tracks lead toward the water. No disturbed patches mark where figures walked. The place resets quickly, as if nothing passed through at all. Local stories attempt explanation. Sandwich Flats have long been used as a crossing point during low tide. Generations moved across this space when conditions allowed, sometimes in groups, sometimes in haste. The flats demanded coordination and timing. People traveled together for safety, watching the fog, the tide, the sky. Some believe the figures are impressions of those crossings. They say the fog reveals patterns left behind by repeated movement, showing echoes of people who once walked here in numbers, guided by necessity rather than choice. The figures moved toward the sea because that was the direction of travel when the flats mattered most. Others believe the fog itself shapes perception. They argue that the brain fills gaps under low visibility, organizing random forms into familiar patterns. Groups appear because the mind seeks order when landmarks disappear. The lack of footprints supports this view, proving the figures are imagined. Yet the consistency troubles skeptics. Witnesses describe similar pacing, similar spacing, similar silence. They report the same direction, the same calm inevitability. These similarities persist across years and observers. The flats are especially deceptive at dusk and dawn. Light at these times is already uncertain, blending sea and sky. Fog arriving then feels thicker, more complete. Colors flatten. Depth disappears. It becomes difficult to judge whether a shape is near or far, solid or hollow. In these conditions, the figures appear most often. Those who linger feel a strange pull to follow. Not a command, not fear, but curiosity sharpened by the absence of sound. The urge is subtle, easily ignored, yet persistent enough to require effort to resist. Some take a step forward before realizing what they are doing, drawn by the simple logic of movement. Locals warn against this. That following anything into fog without clear bearings invites danger. The tide returns quickly here, covering ground without drama or warning. Channels deepen silently. Escape routes close behind. Those who resist the urge and turn back often feel relief quickly. The fog thins. Shapes dissolve. The flats widen again. The sea retreats to its familiar edge. The moment passes, leaving only memory and questions. People who have seen the groups rarely speak of it casually. They describe the experience carefully, aware of how easily it could be dismissed. The lack of footprints troubles them most, leaving the experience suspended between perception and belief. Sandwich Flats remain open and accessible. By day they are a place of light and space, crossed by walkers and birds. By night or fog they become something else, a shifting landscape that resists certainty. The ground may be solid, but direction is not. Fog continues to move quickly here. It slides across the flats as if following invisible contours, revealing and hiding with equal ease. Within it, figures sometimes form, walking together toward the sea, silent and unhurried. They leave no trace. No sound. No mark upon the sand. Only the lingering awareness that this place holds patterns beyond what the eye expects. And that when fog erases distance and certainty. The flats may show not what is present, but what has passed through so many times it learned how to walk again. Always forward. Always together. Always leaving nothing behind. Chatham Flats unfold like a living map, redrawn by the tide every single day. At low tide the sand stretches outward in pale ribbons, carved by channels that twist and vanish without warning. The surface appears smooth and predictable, broken only by shallow pools that reflect the sky. But once people step onto the sand, the illusion fades. The ground slopes gently in every direction, offering few landmarks. What seemed familiar a moment ago becomes uncertain almost immediately. The shoreline behind grows indistinct, blurred by light and distance. The water ahead looks closer than it is. With each step, the sense of orientation weakens, not abruptly, but gradually, as if direction itself is dissolving. Chatham Flats change shape daily. Tides carve new channels overnight, erase old footprints, and smooth away yesterday's routes. What guided them safely one day leads nowhere the next. The constant reshaping affects perception. Without fixed reference points, the mind struggles to track progress. Left and right lose meaning. Straight lines curve without notice. People report walking toward a visible marker only to find themselves drifting off course. The sensation is subtle but persistent. Visitors stop more often than they intend, turning slowly to reassess their surroundings. The flats feel open, yet somehow enclosing, as if the space itself is nudging movement in quiet, indirect ways. As water returns slowly with the tide, the experience deepens. Shallow water slips across the sand, thin enough to walk through without resistance. It reflects light unevenly, masking depth and motion. Feet disturb the surface briefly, then the water settles, erasing evidence of passage. It is in this shallow water that some feel it. A light contact against the legs, brief and unexpected. Not pressure, not impact, but a brushing sensation, as if something has passed by just beneath the surface. People instinctively stop, lifting a foot or stepping back. Nothing is visible. The water remains clear and shallow. No ripples mark movement. Sand lies undisturbed. Yet the sensation lingers for a moment longer, enough to raise awareness and tension. Those who continue walking sometimes feel it again. Always low, always fleeting. The contact never grips or pulls. It passes, then is gone, leaving behind uncertainty rather than fear. The waters here are known to shift quickly. Channels can deepen without warning. Currents change direction beneath a calm surface. Yet even those explanations feel incomplete. The sensation often occurs in places where water appears still. Chatham Flats have always challenged navigation. Historical accounts describe travelers losing their sense of direction while crossing. Fog could roll in suddenly. The sky and sand would blend into a single pale surface. Without landmarks, people walked in wide arcs, convinced they were moving straight. Even today, orientation can fail in clear weather. The flats reflect light unevenly, bending perception. Channels curve in deceptive ways. Distance stretches or compresses without warning. Visitors become more aware of their bodies and movements. Every step requires attention. Emotions shift quietly in response. The mind remains alert, scanning for reference points that never fully stabilize. The brushing sensation beneath the water often appears during these moments. When orientation falters, when attention sharpens, when the mind is actively searching for certainty. The contact feels timed, almost responsive, as if the flats themselves are aware of hesitation. A brief reminder to keep moving. To avoid standing still too long. To remain aware of the changing ground. Others interpret it as curiosity, something passing by to observe without interfering. Whatever its nature, it never repeats insistently. Those who feel it once may not feel it again that day. Others experience it several times in different locations. No pattern explains its appearance fully. As the tide rises higher, the flats begin to close. Channels fill. Sand disappears beneath the water. The sense of disorientation fades as paths become clearer and movement becomes limited. The brushing sensation stops entirely once water deepens beyond the ankle. Leaving the flats brings relief. Solid ground restores balance and direction. Landmarks return. The mind relaxes. Looking back, the flats appear unchanged, wide and quiet under the open sky. Many struggle to explain what they felt. They speak of losing direction more easily than expected. Of moments of uncertainty that felt disproportionate to the conditions. Of something brushing past their legs where nothing should have been. Some return again, drawn by curiosity. They walk more carefully, watch the water closely, test their sense of direction. Often, nothing unusual happens. The flats remain silent and still. Other times, the experience returns. Orientation slips. The land reshapes itself. A brief contact passes beneath the water. The flats remind visitors that they are not static terrain, but an active, shifting environment that resists being fully understood. Chatham Flats do not seek attention. They change quietly, guided by tide and time. They offer no clear paths and no permanent markers. Those who walk them must remain aware, flexible, and humble. In this place, certainty is temporary. Direction is earned moment by moment. And beneath the shallow water, where sand and tide meet, something occasionally moves. Just close enough to be felt. Then disappears, leaving behind only the understanding that the flats are never as empty, or as still, as they appear. Deadwater flats lie far from marked trails and familiar shorelines, a low and open stretch where land thins into water and the horizon loses definition. The ground appears firm at first glance, a broad sheet of pale sand and dark silt that seems to invite careful passage. Locals avoid it. They speak of Deadwater Flats without embellishment, as a place best left alone. The reasons vary depending on who you ask, but they share a common tone of certainty. It is not fear that keeps them away. It is experience, passed down in brief warnings and changed routes. Charts and forecasts do not fully capture how quickly water moves across the flats. The ground sits low, shaped into shallow bowls and channels that fill unevenly. When the tide turns, it does not advance as a single line. It spreads, appearing suddenly in places that were dry moments earlier, cutting off paths without sound. By the time attention sharpens, the landscape has already rearranged itself. Visitors who misjudge the timing often notice the change too late. The water does not rush. It glides, calm and persistent, slipping into depressions and pooling around ankles before the mind registers danger. By the time attention sharpens, the landscape has already rearranged itself. Deadwater flats do not offer landmarks to guide retreat. The surface looks the same in every direction. As water rises, reflections multiply, blurring depth and distance. The safest route becomes difficult to identify, even in clear weather. Those who venture here report another unsettling detail. The sound arrives softly, carried low across the flats, close enough to feel personal. It does not shout or call from afar. It speaks in a calm, reassuring tone, suggesting rest and relief. The words vary, but the message remains consistent. There is no urgency in the voice. No command. Only invitation. Listeners describe the sound as coming from all around rather than a single direction. Turning toward it does not bring clarity. The voice seems to settle just behind awareness, as if speaking directly into thought rather than through air. The timing is notable. The voices are most often reported as the tide begins to rise, when the surface of the flats is still mostly exposed. The conditions feel safe. The water appears manageable. Fatigue has not yet set in. It is at this moment that the suggestion to pause feels most tempting. The idea of continuing seems suddenly exhausting, while stopping feels reasonable and deserved. Rest beneath the water. The phrasing is gentle, presented as comfort rather than danger. Those who hear it often feel a momentary pull to sit or stand still, letting the water rise. Those who resist describe a strong internal conflict. Logic urges movement. The voice counters with calm reassurance. The longer the pause, the stronger the suggestion becomes. People who leave deadwater flats quickly often do so without fully understanding why. They describe an instinct to move, to ignore the sound and focus on distance markers or the shoreline. Once they reach higher ground, the voice fades immediately. Those who linger longer report increased disorientation. Time feels compressed. The water appears closer than expected. The voice grows more persuasive, though never louder. There are no reports of the voice following beyond the flats. It remains tied to the place, fading as soon as solid ground is reached. The effect ends cleanly, leaving behind confusion and relief rather than lingering distress. History provides context without certainty. Deadwater flats have a long record of incidents involving sudden tides and stranded travelers. Rescue efforts were complicated by the speed of water and the lack of clear routes. Many who encountered trouble here were not reckless. They were caught by conditions that changed faster than expected. Some believe the voices reflect echoes of past moments, impressions of exhaustion and surrender released by the landscape. Others suggest that the combination of isolation, rising water, and open space can alter perception, turning internal thoughts into external sound. Neither explanation fully accounts for the consistency of reports or the specific timing of the voices. The flats themselves feel indifferent. They do not threaten or chase. They do not dramatize their danger. They simply change, steadily and without pause, reshaping the ground beneath the water. Those who know the area well emphasize one rule above all others. Never stop moving once the tide begins to turn. This advice is practical rather than mystical. Movement maintains awareness. It keeps the mind focused on distance and direction. Pausing allows the flats to close in quietly, both physically and mentally. Visitors who follow this guidance rarely encounter difficulty. They test ground, watch waterlines, and leave earlier than feels necessary. They do not wait for certainty, knowing it does not exist here. Deadwater flats appear most peaceful just before the tide returns. The surface is smooth. The air is still. The waterline seems far away. It does not contradict the environment. That there is time to rest. That effort can be postponed. Those who hear it and leave carry the memory as a warning rather than a mystery. The experience does not invite return. It reinforces the understanding that the flats operate on their own terms. By the time the tide fully covers the area, deadwater flats are silent. Water spreads evenly, erasing footprints and any trace of hesitation. The landscape becomes uniform again, offering no sign of what was said or heard. Locals continue to avoid the place, choosing longer routes and firmer ground. Their caution is not born of superstition, but respect for a stretch of land that offers comfort at the exact moment it should not be trusted. The tide rises faster than expected, and the ground yields without protest. Those who visit and listen carefully learn the most important lesson the flats have to offer. When a place urges you to stay as the water rises, the safest choice is to keep moving, even when rest sounds inviting, and the calm feels convincing enough to believe. Thank you for walking the haunted tidal flats of Massachusetts with me tonight. These places exist only for a short time each day, revealed and reclaimed by the sea without mercy. They remind us that nature does not forget, and the ocean keeps everything it takes. Some who walk these flats leave with stories they cannot explain. Some leave with fear that follows them into their dreams. And some say they still hear the tide returning, even when far from the shore. If you ever find yourself standing on exposed sand as the water begins to rise, listen carefully. Watch the horizon. And never ignore the feeling that you are being watched. Would you dare to walk alone across a haunted tidal flat as night falls, or would you retreat before the sea closed in around you? Rest well, my friend. Until our next haunted journey.